The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Buckingham Palace, casting long shadows across the marble floors. Princess Charlotte, now 16 years old, walked gracefully through the corridors, her footsteps echoing softly. She had grown into a poised young woman, always mindful of the duties and expectations that came with her royal title. Today was particularly important. She was scheduled to attend a formal ceremony honoring the palace guards, men and women who had dedicated years of their lives to protecting the royal family. Charlotte had always been fascinated by the guards. As a child, she would watch them from her window, standing perfectly still for hours. Their red uniforms pristine, their expressions unreadable. She admired their discipline and wondered what thoughts passed through their minds as they stood there, silent and unmoving. Her mother, the Princess of Wales, had taught her to respect these individuals, reminding her that behind every uniform was a person with a family, dreams, and sacrifices. The ceremony was held in the Grand Hall, a magnificent room adorned with chandeliers and portraits of monarchs past. Rows of guards stood at attention, their medals gleaming under the lights. Charlotte took her place on the stage beside her father, Prince William, and her younger brother, Prince Louis. The air was thick with formality, every movement rehearsed, every word carefully chosen. Charlotte felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her, but she had learned to hide her nervousness behind a calm smile as the ceremony progressed. Speeches were given, honors were bestowed, and the audience applauded politely. Charlotte listened attentively, though her mind occasionally wandered. She noticed one guard in particular, standing near the back of the hall. He was older than most, perhaps in his late 50s, with silver hair visible beneath his bearskin cap. His posture was impeccable. But there was something in his eyes, a distant look, as if he was seeing something far beyond the walls of the palace. When it was her turn to speak, Charlotte stepped forward to the microphone. She had prepared her speech carefully, words of gratitude and respect for the guard's service. But as she began to read, a strange sensation washed over her. The room seemed to tilt slightly, and the lights grew brighter, almost blinding. She blinked, trying to focus on the paper in her hands, but the words blurred together. Her heart began to race, and a cold sweat formed on her forehead. Charlotte paused, taking a breath. She told herself it was just nerves that she needed to push through. She continued speaking, her voice steady despite the growing unease in her chest. But with each word, the sensation intensified. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. She could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, drowning out everything else. Then, without warning, her legs gave out beneath her. The world went dark, and she felt herself falling. The last thing she heard before losing consciousness was the collective gasp of the audience, a sound that seemed to come from very far away. When Charlotte's body hit the floor, chaos erupted in the Grand Hall. People rushed forward, voices calling out in alarm. Her father was at her side in an instant, his hands shaking as he tried to wake her. Medical staff, always present at royal events, pushed through the crowd, their training kicking in immediately. They checked her pulse, her breathing, their movements quick and efficient. But amidst all the commotion, one figure remained completely still. The silver-haired guard at the back of the hall had not moved an inch. His eyes were fixed straight ahead, his expression unchanged. It was his duty to stand motionless, to remain disciplined no matter what happened around him. He had been trained for this, had spent decades perfecting the art of stillness. Even as his fellow guards broke formation to assist, he stayed in place. A testament to the rigorous standards of the royal guard. Charlotte's eyes fluttered. Open after what felt like an eternity, but was only a few seconds. She found herself lying on the cold marble floor, faces hovering above her, concern etched into every feature. Her father's voice cut through the fog in her mind, asking if she was all right, if she could hear him. She nodded weakly, embarrassed by the scene she had caused. This was not how a princess was supposed to behave. She had been taught to maintain composure, to never show weakness in public, as the medical staff helped her to a sitting position. Charlotte's gaze drifted across the room. That's when she saw him, the silver-haired guard, still standing at attention. Everyone else had moved, had reacted, but he remained frozen in place. For a moment, their eyes met. and Charlotte saw something there. Recognition, understanding, perhaps even compassion. But he did not break his stance. Charlotte was helped to her feet, her father's arms supporting her. The ceremony had come to an abrupt halt, and palace officials were already discussing whether to continue or reschedule. But Charlotte, despite feeling dizzy and disoriented, insisted she was fine. She didn't want to disappoint anyone or cause further disruption. She had a role to play, and she was determined to fulfill it, as she was escorted to a side room to rest. Charlotte couldn't stop thinking about the guard who had not moved. There was something deeply moving about his dedication, his unwavering commitment to duty, even in the face of a crisis. She made a mental note to find out who he was, to thank him personally for his service. Little did she know that this moment would lead to a connection that would change both their lives forever. In the quiet of the private room, Charlotte sat on a velvet sofa, a glass of water in her trembling hands. Her mother had been called immediately and was on her way. Charlotte felt foolish, vulnerable, and frustrated with her body for betraying her at such a critical moment. She had always prided herself on her strength, her ability to handle the pressures of royal life with grace. But today she had faltered. A palace doctor examined her, checking her vital signs and asking questions about how she felt before the collapse. Charlotte answered honestly, describing the dizziness, the racing heart, the feeling that the room was closing in. The doctor listened carefully, making notes, his expression thoughtful but not alarmed. He suggested it could be stress, dehydration, or perhaps something that required further testing. Charlotte nodded, agreeing to whatever was necessary. But her mind was elsewhere. She kept seeing the guard's face, that moment when their eyes had met. There was something in his gaze that haunted her, a sadness mixed with strength. She wondered about his story, about what had brought him to this life of service and discipline. Most people saw the guards as symbols, as part of the pageantry and tradition of the monarchy. But Charlotte had always seen them as individuals, each with their own struggles and triumphs. When her mother finally arrived, Catherine embraced her daughter tightly, relief and worry evident in her expression. She listened as the doctor explained his preliminary assessment and assured Charlotte that these things happened, that even the strongest people had moments of vulnerability. Charlotte appreciated her mother's words, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something more significant had occurred today, something that went beyond a simple fainting spell. 3 days passed before Charlotte was allowed to return to her regular schedule. The palace had released a brief statement explaining that the princess had experienced a momentary spell due to exhaustion, and she was now resting comfortably. The media had, predictably, exploded with speculation and concern, but Charlotte tried not to read the headlines. She knew how quickly stories could spiral out of control, how a simple health scare could become fodder for endless rumors. During her recovery, Charlotte spent her time reading, sketching, and thinking. She had always been introspective, prone to deep contemplation about her role in the world. Being born into royalty meant living a life that was both privileged and constrained. Every action was scrutinized, every word analyzed. There was little room for genuine spontaneity or privacy. But Charlotte had learned to find moments of authenticity within the structure, small rebellions that kept her spirit alive. One afternoon, as she sat by her bedroom window watching the guards change shift in the courtyard below, Charlotte made a decision. She wanted to meet the silver-haired guard who had remained at his post. She wanted to understand what drove such unwavering dedication. Her private secretary initially resisted the idea, explaining that it was unusual for members of the royal family to request personal meetings with individual guards. But Charlotte was persistent, and eventually, arrangements were made. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday in one of the palace's smaller reception rooms. Charlotte chose the location carefully, wanting it to feel less formal. It's more like a conversation between two people rather than a royal audience. She arrived early, smoothing her dress and checking her reflection in a mirror. She felt nervous, though she couldn't quite explain why. Perhaps it was because this meeting felt important in a way she didn't fully understand yet. When the guard entered the room, Charlotte was struck by how different he looked out of his formal uniform. He wore a simple suit, his silver hair neatly combed, and there was a gentleness to his features that the stern guard's expression had hidden. He bowed respectfully, and Charlotte gestured for him to sit. She noticed his hands were weathered, marked by years of service, and there was a slight tremor in his fingers. Charlotte began by thanking him for coming, explaining that she had wanted to meet him personally after the ceremony. The guard, whose name was Thomas Hartley, listened quietly, his eyes respectful but curious. Charlotte asked him about his service, how long he had been with the Royal Guard, and what had drawn him to this life. Thomas spoke slowly, his voice deep and measured, clearly unused to such personal conversations with royalty. He explained that he had joined the Guard 40 years ago, following in his father's footsteps. It had been a source of pride for his family, a tradition passed down through generations. He had served through changing times, had stood guard during moments of great celebration and profound sorrow. He had witnessed royal weddings, funerals, and countless ceremonies. Through it all, he had maintained his commitment to duty, to the discipline that defined his role. Charlotte listened intently, fascinated by the life he described. She asked him about the day of the ceremony, about why he had remained still when everyone else had rushed to help. Thomas paused before answering, choosing his words carefully. He explained that it had been one of the most difficult moments of his career. Every instinct had screamed at him to break formation, to help the young princess who had collapsed. But his training, decades of conditioning, had kept him rooted in place. Then Thomas said something that surprised Charlotte. He confessed that, in that moment, when their eyes had met, he had seen something in her expression that reminded him of his own daughter. He explained that his daughter Sarah had passed away 10 years ago from a heart condition. She had been only 25, full of life and promise, when she had suddenly collapsed one evening. Thomas had not been there when it happened. He had been on duty at the palace, standing guard, while his daughter died in a hospital miles away. The room fell silent. Charlotte felt tears prick her eyes as she listened to Thomas's story. He spoke without bitterness, but the pain in his voice was evident. He had carried this guilt for a decade, the knowledge that he had been standing still, doing his duty, while his child took her last breath. It had nearly broken him, had made him question everything he believed about service and sacrifice. Charlotte reached across the small table between them and gently placed her hand on his. It was an unusual gesture, one that broke royal protocol, but she didn't care. She told Thomas how sorry she was for his loss, how she couldn't imagine the pain he had endured. She also told him that his dedication was not a betrayal of his daughter, but rather a testament to the strength she must have seen in him. Sarah would have been proud of her father's commitment. Even in the face of unimaginable grief, Thomas looked up, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. He thanked Charlotte for her words, for taking the time to see him as more than just a guard in a uniform. He admitted that he had been planning to retire soon, that the weight of the memories had become too heavy to bear. But this conversation, this moment of genuine human connection, had reminded him why he had chosen this path in the first place. It wasn't about standing still or following orders blindly. It was about being part of something larger than himself, about serving with honor and dignity. Charlotte found herself opening up as well, sharing her own struggles with the pressures of royal life. She talked about the constant scrutiny, the feeling that she could never truly be herself, the fear that one mistake could define her forever. Thomas listened with the same quiet attention he had given to his duties for 4 decades. When she finished speaking, he offered her a piece of advice that would stay with her for years to come. He told her that true strength wasn't about never falling. It was about what you did after you hit the ground. He had learned this the hard way through loss and regret, but he had also learned that vulnerability could be a form of courage, that admitting weakness took more strength than pretending to be invincible. Charlotte absorbed these words, feeling as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Before Thomas left, Charlotte made a promise to him. She would attend a memorial service for his daughter, if he would have her. It would be a private affair, away from the cameras and the public eye. Thomas was moved by the gesture, accepting gratefully. As he stood to leave, he bowed once more, but this time it felt different. It wasn't the formal bow of a guard to a princess, but rather the respectful acknowledgement between two people who had shared something meaningful. After Thomas departed, Charlotte sat alone in the reception room for a long time. She thought about duty and sacrifice, about the hidden stories behind every face she encountered in the palace. She realized that her collapse had not been a moment of weakness, but rather an opportunity. A chance to connect with someone who needed to be seen and heard. It had reminded her that her position came with responsibilities, but also with the power to make a difference in individual lives. In the days that followed, Charlotte returned to her public duties with renewed purpose. She attended events, gave speeches, and fulfilled her obligations with grace. But she also made an effort to look beyond the formalities, to see the people who surrounded her, the staff who worked tirelessly behind the scenes, the guards who stood watch in all weather. She learned their names, asked about their families, showed genuine interest in their lives. The memorial service for Sarah Hartley was held on a quiet Sunday morning in a small chapel outside London. Charlotte attended with only one security officer, dressed simply, her hair pulled back. Thomas was there with his wife, Margaret, and a handful of close friends and family members. The service was beautiful, filled with stories of Sarah's kindness, her love of music, and her bright spirit. Charlotte listened, feeling honored to be included in this intimate gathering. Afterward, as they stood in the chapel garden, Margaret approached Charlotte. She was a small woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. She thanked the princess for coming, for showing her husband such compassion. Margaret explained that Thomas had been changed by their conversation, that he had finally begun to forgive himself for not being there when Sarah died. Charlotte felt humbled by these words, realizing that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could have the most profound impact. Months passed, and Charlotte's relationship with Thomas Hartley evolved into something unexpected. They began meeting regularly, always in private, away from the formalities of Palace's life. Thomas became a mentor of sorts, someone Charlotte could talk to without the usual constraints. He offered perspectives shaped by decades of experience, wisdom earned through both triumph and tragedy. Charlotte found herself looking forward to these conversations. Treasuring the honesty and depth they shared, Thomas taught Charlotte about the history of the Royal Guard, stories that went far beyond what she had learned in her formal education. He spoke of guards who had served through wars, who had protected monarchs during times of great danger, who had witnessed history unfold from their silent posts. Each story revealed the humanity behind the uniform, the fears and hopes of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Charlotte began to see the palace itself differently, understanding that every corner held untold stories. Every face had a hidden depth. One afternoon, as autumn leaves fell in the palace gardens, Thomas shared another piece of his past. He told Charlotte about a moment early in his career when he had almost quit. He had been standing guard during a particularly long ceremony, his feet aching, his body exhausted. A fellow guard beside him had whispered a joke, trying to lighten the mood. Thomas had struggled not to smile, had fought to maintain his composure. The other guard was reprimanded later, given a stern warning about discipline. That night, Thomas had gone home questioning everything. Was this really what he wanted? To stand like a statue, to suppress every human impulse for the sake of tradition. His father, also a former guard, had found him sitting alone in their small garden. The older man had sat down beside his son and told him something that changed everything. He said that being a guard wasn't about becoming inhuman. It was about controlling yourself so completely that you could choose when to act and when to remain still. It was the ultimate form of self-mastery. Charlotte understood the deeper meaning behind this story. Thomas was teaching her about control, about the power that came from choosing how to respond to the world rather than simply reacting. As a princess, she lived under constant observation, her every movement documented and analyzed, learning to control her responses, to choose her battles, to remain composed when necessary. These were skills that would serve her throughout her life. But Thomas also emphasized the importance of knowing when to break the rules. He confessed that there had been times when he had bent protocols, small acts of humanity that went unnoticed by most. Once, during a rainstorm, he had slightly adjusted his stance to shield a young child from the wind. Another time, he had quietly directed a lost tourist to safety rather than maintaining absolute stillness. These tiny rebellions against rigid discipline had kept his humanity intact, had reminded him that rules served people, not the other way around. Charlotte began applying these lessons to her own life. She learned when to follow protocol precisely, and when a small gesture of genuine humanity mattered more than tradition. During a hospital visit, she spent extra time with a sick child, ignoring her tight schedule. At a formal dinner, she engaged in real conversation with staff members, asking about their lives rather than offering polite but empty pleasantries. These moments felt like small victories, ways of asserting her own values within the constraints of her role. The palace staff began to notice changes in Princess Charlotte. She was still poised and professional, but there was a warmth that hadn't been there before. People felt seen by her, heard in a way that went beyond courtesy. Word spread quietly among the staff that the princess was different, that she genuinely cared. This reputation, built through countless small interactions, became one of her greatest strengths. Meanwhile, Thomas was approaching his final days of service. His retirement had been set for December, a bittersweet ending to a lifetime of dedication. The palace planned a ceremony to honor his 40 years of service, but Thomas had requested something simple. He had spent his career avoiding attention, standing in the background while history happened around him. He wanted to leave the same way, quietly and without fanfare. Charlotte had other ideas. She understood Thomas's humility, but she also believed his story deserved to be told. With his permission, she arranged for a small gathering, not of dignitaries and officials, but of the people who had served alongside him. Former guards, palace staff, people whose lives Thomas had touched over the decades. The event would be intimate, focused on celebrating the man rather than the uniform. The night before Thomas's retirement ceremony, Charlotte couldn't sleep. She found herself thinking about all the conversations they had shared, the lessons she had learned. She realized that Thomas had given her something invaluable, a different way of seeing her role and her responsibilities. He had shown her that strength could be quiet, that influence didn't always require grand gestures, that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was simply stand firm in your values. Charlotte also thought about Sarah, Thomas's daughter, whom she had never met, but felt she knew through her father's stories. Sarah had been a music teacher, passionate about helping children discover their creativity. She had volunteered at community centers, had brought joy to countless young lives. Her death had been sudden and unfair, leaving a hole in the world that could never be filled. But through Thomas's grief, Charlotte had learned about the enduring power of love, how it transcended death and continued to shape the lives of those left behind. The retirement ceremony was held in the same grand hall where Charlotte had collapsed months earlier. But this time, the atmosphere was completely different. Instead of formal speeches and rigid protocols, there was genuine warmth and celebration. Thomas stood at the center, surrounded by people who had become his extended family over 4 decades. Charlotte watched as former colleagues shared stories, some funny, some touching, all revealing the impact Thomas had made through his quiet presence. When it was Charlotte's turn to speak, she walked to the front of the room, carrying a small wooden box. She had spent weeks preparing this gift, working with palace artisans to create something meaningful. Inside the box was a medal, but not an official royal decoration. Instead, it was a custom piece engraved with the dates of Thomas's service and a simple inscription that read, "For standing strong through every season, for serving with heart and honor." Charlotte spoke from her heart, without notes or prepared remarks. She talked about what Thomas had taught her, how their unlikely friendship had changed her understanding of duty and service. She shared the story of their first conversation, when Thomas had revealed his grief and vulnerability. She explained how that moment had shown her that true strength included the courage to be human, to acknowledge pain and loss rather than hiding behind a facade of perfection. The room was silent as Charlotte spoke, every person present understanding the significance of her words. This was not typical royal protocol. Princesses didn't usually form close friendships with guards or speak so openly about personal connections. But Charlotte had learned from Thomas that sometimes breaking the rules with grace and purpose was exactly what the moment required. When she finished speaking, Charlotte approached Thomas and handed him the box. As he opened it and saw the medal inside, tears rolled down his weathered cheeks. He had received many official honors throughout his career, but none had touched him like this simple gift from a young woman who had truly seen him, who had looked beyond the uniform to the person underneath. Thomas stood and embraced Charlotte. Another breach of protocol that no one in the room seemed to mind. In that embrace was gratitude, respect, and a deep mutual understanding. They had helped each other heal, had given each other perspective and hope. Thomas whispered words only Charlotte could hear, thanking her for reminding him that his life's work had meaning, that his sacrifices had not been in vain. After the ceremony, as guests mingled and shared refreshments, Charlotte stood by a window looking out at the palace grounds. Margaret Hartley joined her, the two women standing in comfortable silence. Margaret finally spoke, her voice soft but firm. She told Charlotte that Sarah would have liked her very much, that she had the same gentle strength her daughter had possessed. Charlotte felt honored by the comparison, understanding the profound gift Margaret had just given her. The weeks following Thomas's retirement felt strange to Charlotte. She had grown accustomed to their regular conversations, to having someone she could confide in without judgment or expectation. The palace seemed a little emptier, without his steady presence among the guards. But their friendship didn't end with his departure from service. Thomas and Margaret lived in a modest cottage about an hour from London, and Charlotte made it a point to visit whenever her schedule allowed. These visits were precious to Charlotte, offering her a glimpse into a life completely different from her own. The cottage was cozy and filled with memories, photographs of Sarah throughout her life covering every surface. Margaret would prepare tea while Thomas tended to his small garden. They would sit for hours talking about everything and nothing, the conversation flowing naturally without the weight of royal protocol. During one visit in early spring, Thomas showed Charlotte his workshop, a small shed at the back of the property. Inside were woodworking tools and several projects in various stages of completion. Thomas explained that he had taken up woodworking as a way to stay busy in retirement. The physical work helped him process his emotions, channeling decades of stillness into creative movement. He was currently building a music box, tribute to Sarah's love of music. Charlotte watched as Thomas's weathered hands worked the wood with surprising delicacy. He explained each step of the process, the importance of patience and precision, how rushing could ruin hours of careful work. Charlotte saw the parallel he was drawing to life itself, how the most meaningful things required time and attention, how forcing outcomes often led to disappointment. She asked if she could learn, and Thomas smiled, handing her a piece of sandpaper and showing her the proper technique for smoothing rough edges. They worked together in companionable silence, the sound of sandpaper against wood creating a soothing rhythm. Charlotte found the repetitive motion meditative, her mind quieting in a way it rarely did. Thomas occasionally offered guidance, but mostly let her learn through doing. When she made mistakes, he simply showed her how to fix them, never criticizing or showing frustration. This approach to teaching, patient and encouraging, was something Charlotte would remember and apply in her own interactions with others. As spring turned to summer, Charlotte faced new challenges in her public role. She was given more responsibilities, more official duties that required her to step into the spotlight. There were moments of self-doubt, times when the pressure felt overwhelming. During these difficult periods, she would think about Thomas standing motionless at his post, about the discipline and inner strength that had sustained him through decades of service. If he could endure hours of physical discomfort while carrying the weight of personal tragedy, she could handle a few uncomfortable public appearances. But Charlotte also remembered Thomas's lessons about vulnerability and humanity. She didn't have to be perfect. She could acknowledge her struggles while still fulfilling her duties. During a particularly challenging speech at a youth mental health event, Charlotte spoke candidly about her own experiences with anxiety and pressure. She shared how learning to ask for help, to admit when she was struggling, had been one of the hardest but most important lessons of her life. The response to her honesty was overwhelming. Young people reached out through various channels, thanking her for making them feel less alone. Mental health organizations praised her courage in speaking openly about such personal issues. The palace initially worried about the public reaction, concerned that Charlotte's vulnerability might be seen as weakness. But the opposite proved true. People connected with her authenticity. saw her as someone real rather than a distant figurehead. Thomas watched Charlotte's growing confidence with pride. When she visited to tell him about the response to her speech, he listened with that same quiet attention he had given to everything throughout his life. Then he told her something she would never forget. He said that the moment she had collapsed in the grand hall, the moment that had brought them together, had been a gift. It had forced her to confront her limitations, to recognize that she was human, and in doing so, it had made her stronger and more compassionate than she could have become otherwise. Charlotte realized he was right. That moment of weakness had opened doors she hadn't known existed. It had led her to Thomas, to these lessons, to a deeper understanding of herself and her role. She had learned that being a princess wasn't about being flawless or untouchable. It was about using her position to connect with people, to shine a light on important issues, to show that even those born into privilege face challenges and struggles as autumn approached. Charlotte prepared for a major milestone. She would be giving her first completely independent speech at the United Nations, addressing young leaders from around the world. The topic was resilience and service, and Charlotte had worked for months on her remarks. But a week before the speech, doubt crept in. She called Thomas, her voice shaking as she explained her fears about speaking to such an important audience. Thomas listened, then asked her a simple question. What did she want people to remember after she finished speaking? Charlotte thought for a moment, then replied that she wanted them to feel empowered, to understand that they didn't have to have all the answers or be perfect to make a difference. Thomas told her that if she could hold on to that intention, if she could speak from that place of genuine desire to help others, the rest would take care of itself. The day of the speech arrived, and Charlotte stood backstage, her heart racing just as it had in the grand hall. But this time, she had tools to manage her anxiety. She thought about Thomas's stillness, about the way he had learned to control his mind and body through years of practice. She took deep breaths, centered herself, and stepped onto the stage with purpose. Charlotte's speech was powerful and personal. She talked about duty and service, but also about the importance of self-care and vulnerability. She shared her own journey, including the moment she had collapsed and how it had taught her valuable lessons about strength and humanity. She spoke about Thomas without using his name, describing a mentor who had shown her that true courage included the willingness to be imperfect and human. The audience responded with a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. Young leaders from dozens of countries approached her afterward, sharing their own stories and thanking her for her honesty. Charlotte felt a sense of fulfillment she had never experienced before. This was why her position mattered. Not for the ceremonies or the protocol, but for moments like these when she could genuinely connect with people and perhaps inspire them to be their best selves. When Charlotte returned home, she immediately went to visit Thomas and Margaret. She wanted to share the experience while it was still fresh, to thank Thomas once again for his guidance. They sat in the cottage garden as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Charlotte described every detail of the day, her excitement evident in every word. Thomas listened with his characteristic, quiet attention, occasionally asking questions or offering gentle observations. When Charlotte finished talking, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the music box he had been building. It was complete now, beautifully crafted and polished to a warm shine. He wound the key and opened the lid, and a delicate melody filled the evening air. It was Sarah's favorite song, Thomas explained, one she used to play for her students. Charlotte felt tears stream down her face as she listened to the music. The melody was both sad and hopeful, a perfect expression of loss transformed into something beautiful. Thomas placed the music box in Charlotte's hands, telling her it was a gift. He wanted her to have it, to remember that even in the midst of sorrow, beauty could be created. Life was like woodworking, he said. You started with rough materials, shaped them through patient effort, and if you approached the work with care and intention, you could create something meaningful. Charlotte held the music box carefully. Understanding the significance of this gift, Thomas had poured his grief, his love for his daughter, and his hope for the future into this small wooden box. By giving it to Charlotte, he was entrusting her with part of his story, believing that she would carry it forward and let it inform her work in the world. Years would pass. And Charlotte would go on to do remarkable things. She would champion causes for mental health, support organizations that helped young people find their purpose, and continue to speak openly about the challenges of public life. Throughout it all, she would keep the music box on her desk, a constant reminder of the lessons Thomas had taught her. Whenever she faced difficult decisions or felt overwhelmed by her responsibilities, she would wind the key and listen to Sarah's song. Letting the melody center her and remind her of what truly mattered, Thomas and Margaret became like family to Charlotte. She visited regularly, and they were included in private family celebrations. Prince William and Catherine were initially surprised by their daughter's unlikely friendship with a retired guard, but they soon came to appreciate the positive influence Thomas had on Charlotte. He had given their daughter something they couldn't provide, an outside perspective rooted in decades of real-world experience and hard-won wisdom. On Charlotte's 18th birthday, Thomas attended a small private celebration at the palace. It was the first time he had returned since his retirement, and walking through the familiar halls stirred complex emotions. But he wasn't there as a guard anymore. He was there as a friend, someone who had watched Charlotte grow into a remarkable young woman and felt privileged to have played a small part in her journey. During the celebration, Charlotte gave a toast. She thanked her family for their support, her friends for their loyalty, and then she turned to Thomas. She said that sometimes the most important teachers came from unexpected places, that wisdom wasn't confined to classrooms or royal tutors. She credited Thomas with teaching her about real strength, about the balance between duty and humanity, about the courage it took to be vulnerable while remaining principled. The room raised their glasses to Thomas, who sat quietly, his eyes glistening with tears. Margaret squeezed his hand, both of them understanding that their lives had been changed by this connection as much as Charlotte's had. From the tragedy of losing Sarah had come something unexpected and beautiful, a friendship that had helped them heal and given new meaning to Thomas's years of service. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Charlotte walked Thomas and Margaret to their car. The palace grounds were quiet, lit by soft lights that cast gentle shadows. Before they drove away, Thomas took Charlotte's hands in his and looked at her seriously. He told her that she had a rare gift, the ability to see people for who they truly were and to make them feel valued. He encouraged her to hold on to that quality, to never let the demands of royal life harden her heart or distance her from her humanity. Charlotte hugged Thomas tightly, thanking him for everything. She promised to continue the work they had talked about, to use her platform to highlight the stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. She would make sure that people like Thomas, who served with quiet dedication, were recognized and celebrated. She would fight to make mental health support more accessible, honoring Sarah's memory by helping young people who struggled. As Charlotte watched the car disappear into the night, she felt grateful for that moment in the grand hall when she had collapsed. What had seemed like a failure, a moment of weakness, had actually been the beginning of one of the most important relationships of her life. It had taught her that sometimes falling was exactly what you needed to do, that the path to strength often ran through vulnerability, and that the most profound connections came from being willing to be truly seen.